Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the next edition of In Conversation Live. You're all very welcome. Well, this evening, I'm pleased to say we have a very famous, well-known doctor, Mark Douglas Britnell, who's not only a great guy, but a senior partner at professional services firm KPMG and global healthcare expert. He was chairman and senior partner for healthcare, government and infrastructure at KPMG until September 2020. Before that, he was Director General at the Department of Health and a member of the Management Board of the National Health Service in England, as well as Chief Executive of the University Hospitals Birmingham NHS Foundation Trust and the South Central Strategic Health Authority. Mark, you are so welcome.
Hi, Roger. Good evening.
Good evening. Mark, I'm going to start with a very direct question, because if I don't ask, then everybody else is going to ask. So, Mark, are you up for the job as replacement of Sir Simon Stevens in NHS England, or are you keeping your cards close to your chest?
Well, how unlike you to start with a direct question, Roger. I think it's one of the best jobs in the world. It's obviously one of the most challenging as well. I'm thinking very seriously about it, and the honest answer is I don't know what to do yet. So I guess you could say I'm keeping my cards close to my chest, but I'm actually thinking very actively about it, but I haven't made my mind up. But thanks for asking the question. You'll be the first to know once I decide.
Well, that's nice. And you were actually in the frame in the last two times that the job was around. I read on Wikipedia. Is that right?
Well, you shouldn't always believe what you read on Wikipedia. No, I've not applied before. I've been approached, but I'm sure many other people have been approached as well. So no, I've not applied before. Wiki is not quite correct in asserting that. But as I say, it is an amazing job. The NHS is the 5th largest employer in the world. It's the largest employer in the United Kingdom. It is still widely admired and respected around the world. Of course, it's not perfect, and we can learn from others, as my first book, In Search of the Perfect Health System, points out. But no, it's a brilliant job. And of course, the NHS has helped and is helping this country get back on its feet. So the vaccination program alone, I think, is made again popular perception and popular gratitude soar to new and higher levels. And so it's a great institution. When I travel around the world, of course, everyone loves their health system, but all health systems are a product of a nation's history. And as ours was formed after the Second World War, where so many people sacrificed their lives, there is an umbilical cord between the NHS and the people. And I think any country that showcased in the Olympics, as we did in 2012, how pleased and proud we are of our NHS, I think it speaks volumes about us as a society and us as a people. So it's a great job. But as you appreciate, if you do decide to apply, and whoever gets the job, she or he, then that's a commitment for 5 to 7 years where you won't be doing much else. So that's the balance in terms of my thought process at the moment, but thank you for asking the question.
Got it. Well, you mentioned your book. In fact, you've got 2 books, haven't you? We'll come on to those. And you mentioned your travel. I think you've been to 80 different countries, looking at all those different healthcare systems. So we'll do a sort of round the world in 80 days, 80 countries. So that resonates too. But let's go. We often say that this program is a bit like Desert Island Disc, but with no music. And no desert island for that matter. But let's go right back to the beginning, because you didn't go to a posh school like Eton or Winchester. You were brought up in Chester, is that right? Tell us a little bit about the background and then which university you went to and so on, Mark. I think everyone would be interested in that.
No, sure. No, I was born in a 2-up, 2-down council house in Chester. My father, who's now died, was a bricklayer. My mother, who sadly also passed away, was a telephonist. And I lived in Chester for the first 18 years of my life. It was a bit rough and tough, to be honest with you. And I went to a good comprehensive school and basically excelled at football and sport. Mm-hmm. So nobody's obviously ever been to university in my family before. And I remember at about 11 or 12, when I didn't have that much confidence academically, I was quite a handy footballer, sweeper, centre half, if you will. But I remember my English teacher, Mr. Selby, saying, come on, I did a piece of poor homework. It wasn't the first time, by the way. And he said, look, you're better than this. And he gave me some belief in myself. And so I started to think about perhaps it's possible to go to university, not knowing anybody in my family or my local community that had been to university. And I have to say it was the making of me to go to university. So yeah, I went to a comprehensive school, and I think it's important that people have balance and understand how the real world is. And I worked harder for my A levels. Studied the humanities, English, history, geography, and general studies, and got 4 A levels, and then off I went to Warwick.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about Warwick, because my son was head of the union there, president of the union there, so I got a lot of affection for Warwick. I mean, it just seems like a great buzzy place, modern, very outward-looking, very modern in its approach. Did you enjoy that there? And you were involved in the union yourself, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, I was also elected. I was elected sabbatical treasurer for 1 year, so I did 4 years as well. Right. I read history, and it was the making of me, to be honest with you. You know, because we were poor growing up. We never had the chance to travel anywhere. I think I went on holiday up till the age of 18, 19. And then going to this university and meeting all sorts of people was just a wonderful kaleidoscope of opportunity. And it was the making of me. It helped me think critically. I gained my independence, which was important. It's a lovely campus, as you know. It came out of the 1960s hope for our country in terms of science and engineering. It was located in, they call it Warwick, as you know, Roger, but it's nearer Coventry, but they would never stand for that. But it was linked to manufacturing in the car industry. And it was one of, I think, a new model group of universities that wanted to make its mark on the industrial stage as well as the academic stage. And of course, it's been very, very successful. It's consistently placed now in the top 10 universities in the United Kingdom. It's an upstart university. I don't know whether it's changed. I haven't been back for a while, but I really enjoyed it. The freedom to think for yourself and to learn from others and to mix with all sorts of people. And of course, as you know, Roger, because your son was there, it always had a big international arm as well. So I was bumping into people who were obviously, who were born in different countries, and just getting to mix with people for the first time and understand their point of view and their cultures was really something special. And as you said to me offline, just as we were talking before we came on stage, virtual stage, its social amenities weren't too bad either.
That students' union was absolutely buzzing when my boy was there. Well, it's a message from Kathy Winfield. She says, go for it, Mark. And there's
thanks, Kathy.
Questions about privatizing the NHS and how do we deal with the million waiting list. But before we get on to that, let's continue with your career, because there must have been something that attracted you to healthcare, because you stayed on to study healthcare management at Warwick. Is that right?
Yeah. So yes. So I finished history after 4 years, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I thought to begin with I wanted to be a lawyer, so I went back to Chester and went to law school, and Chester's got a very good law school there. And then after that first year, I decided law wasn't for me. After spending 4 years thinking about history and the sort of tectonic changes and forces at play across the world, to have to sign a register at 7:30 in the morning and then rope learn law, it wasn't quite to my fancy. So I drew on my experiences of running the Students' Union, which obviously has lots of people, lots of resources, infrastructure and money. And I really wanted to do something with a social purpose, and I wanted to run large, complex organizations. And as I said at the beginning, that there isn't a larger or more complex organization than the NHS. So I joined the management training scheme, and that's the NHS equivalent of the of the civil service fast stream. So, and the postgraduate education, ironically, was at Warwick University Business School, which obviously has also gone from strength to strength. It's one of the best business schools now in the country, if not the world. So I joined the NHS Management Training Scheme for 2 years, and that's a 2-year course. So you have, you get a wonderful 3 months cook's tour. So I spent 2 weeks with junior doctors, with porters, with cleaners, with nurses, with mortuary assistants, as well as managers and executives. And then the second phase is a proper job, a baby job, where you get to manage and work with staff and resources, and then you have your academic program, and then finally you have an elective, a little bit like doctors do. And I went to Australia, so I worked in public and private hospitals in Melbourne and Sydney, and it was an eye-opener, because I think at that age then I started to realise there's a big wide world out there, and they don't all do it the same way as we do, and we don't do it the same way as they do. And therefore, it's a great opportunity to learn. So I spent 2 years doing that. And then I went back to the civil service fast stream. I was asked to go and do a year at the Department of Health, when I then worked for a health minister called Stephen Durrell. You might remember him. Yeah. And I did a year there. So they were sort of my formative years and my formal training to be a manager in the NHS.
Did you ever think about being a clinician? Did you ever think that you should have done medicine, or were you always management was what you were interested in?
I wasn't strong enough in my sciences, to be honest with you. I'm old enough to have done O-levels, and I got B's for physics, chemistry and biology. So I just wasn't strong enough, where I was always strong on English, geography, history, where I did better than that. So I'd never thought about being a doctor. And the other thing is, Roger, and I don't want to overplay this, but when you come from an environment and a family where people haven't been to universities, where you don't know doctors or lawyers or engineers, it's quite difficult to position yourself or think yourself into those positions. You need to meet people. Yeah. And I only did law because I thought, I don't know what to do. And that's another 2 years where I can pick up a really prestigious qualification. And I suddenly realized I actually like running organizations, because people run organizations and I like people. So no, sadly, I'm not good enough to be a doctor. I haven't got a bias towards science, but I was trained well as a manager. And the management training scheme, as you know, only picks, or in my day, picked 50 or 60 people. And it's a really good training scheme. And the irony is, now I see some of my mates that went to law school and that they're all burnt out, and that they spent 30 years in law, and I've not for 1 second or 1 minute in my professional career ever regretted joining healthcare, because there was a great professor in Birmingham called Charlie Chan. I don't know if you know him. He's a gynecologist. He said all of life and death is in healthcare, and you'll find it. And he wasn't lying, and I have, and it's a wonderful journey.
We'll go back to your CV, but whilst we're on this subject of management and clinical medicine, you know, there has been, I mean, I think it's not good for healthcare that managers and clinicians are often kind of struggling against each other. There's a conflict there. I mean, do you perceive that, and do you think there's any way that we can resolve that for the benefit of patients?
Well, I've always been very clear that the best leaders are clinicians, physicians, surgeons, nurses, allied health professionals. And my job, and people like me, our job is to support clinicians do better things, because at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, the human contact and specialist expertise between a practitioner and a patient is what's important. So I think to a certain extent, I never came in with a mindset of a sort of old-fashioned bureaucrat that wanted to have some artificial sense of power over clinicians. It's just the wrong mindset. And to be honest with you, I've only ever seen my job as trying to help clinicians do more and do better. So I recognize the situation and the point you're putting to me. And of course, where you do have that divide, that's where organizations start to go terribly wrong. And sadly, as we all know, when organizations go terribly wrong, it's not the clinicians that suffer invariably, it's the patients. And so I would say the one thing I am proud about is every organization I've worked in in the NHS, I've always maintained really healthy relationships. I've always created management structures that put clinicians at the forefront, and our job is to support clinicians. So I recognise what you're saying. Of course it happens, but there's no good that can come of that division. We have to learn to get along, and frankly, that's not even acceptable in the 21st century. Clinicians must lead, and others must support them in leading the service. And I've always believed that. And I think what's nice about my 32-year journey in healthcare is it's becoming day by day more of a truism. It's difficult for the clinicians that have to lead because they've got to lead their flock and also serve corporate and sometimes political interests. But just because it's hard doesn't make it wrong. It's actually right that clinicians should lead.
Yeah. Well, Graham Wynyard, I think you know him,
Okay, Graham.
is asking a question. So we'll get a bit deviated by the questions, but I think that's great. I love to involve the people. That's the whole point of this thing, really. Graham says, you're very committed to education and training when we work together in NHS South Central. Everybody accepts the crucial importance of workforce planning in the NHS, yet we seem unable to find an effective way of doing it in a decentralized system. Why is it, do you think, and what could we do to improve that? So workforce issues there.
So just another small question. Well, hi, Graham. And Graham and I worked when he was Dean of Wessex. And for those that don't know what South Central was, it was the Strategic Health Authority from Oxford to the Isle of Wight that oversaw the care for 5.5 million people. And when I joined, I was commuting daily at one stage from Birmingham down to Oxford and then to Newbury. And I met Graham, who has always been an innovator. So to take your question in turn, Graham, our university sector, along with professional services and other service sectors, is something that the world envies. Our university sector is second to none, and our reach and power in medical education, especially given the centuries of development, is something that we should treasure and marvel. And by the way, export as well. But of course, with workforce planning, as I've argued in my second book, Human, Solving the Global Workforce Crisis in Healthcare, workforce planning in health, not only in this country, but across the world, has been too regressive, too timid, too traditional, and too retrospective. And that's because it thinks you can plot A and arrive at C in a linear fashion, whilst the world is changing more quickly day by day. So having said that the strengths are the tradition, workforce education and planning needs to become much more agile. And if there's time later on, Roger, I'd like to talk about my book, because as far as I'm concerned, that the most important thing right now for the future sustainability of the NHS and the prosperity of this country is our workforce in health and social care. So you probably have seen, and Graham knows this because Graham educated me many years ago, that we do need to increase our training numbers. We can all look at each other and point the finger about whose fault it was from the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010. Funding has played a big issue, but also demarcations and turf wars have also played their part as well. And I genuinely think now that if you think about the collapse of the hospitality and retail sector at the base of the pyramid, and you think about still now the numbers that want to apply to be medics in particular, we'll talk about attrition rates later on. Really, this country has an opportunity to export and increase training overseas and also at home. And I think in terms of any new industrial strategy, thinking about the skills base for the underemployed and the unemployed to come into health, as we've seen during COVID, and also to promote now and stimulate more people who want to apply to medicine. I know there are quality issues, and we'll come back to that, but this is our moment. This is the moment where we train and educate many, many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands more clinicians. And I say that because the world by 2030 is forecasting a shortfall of workers in healthcare of 18 million. And that represents roughly 20% of the total capacity to care. Now, we know in terms of global migration movements for healthcare, it's from the poor south to the rich north, north, from the poor east to the rich west. But those routes, those trade routes of doctors and nurses in particular, they're going to change, and they are changing because of COVID. Just one fact, at the moment, 24% of our medical staff were born overseas. And many of those, of course, come from India. Now, many of us have got friends, medical friends, just colleagues and friends in India. Just before this call today, I was speaking to people in India. They claim it's much worse than is being reported, and it's now arriving in the villages. I make the point only because historically we've been happy to rely on India, but Modi proclaimed 2 years ago, we've done some work trying to help him with this, that he wanted to create universal healthcare and basically provide free or affordable care for 550 million of the poorest Indians in his country. Now, after COVID, and with that goal, which is, as you know, United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, I don't think we can rely on our old trade routes, which, have, as you know, Roger, have developed over centuries, frankly, or at least decades. So why do I say that? Instead of actually just borrowing or stealing all the time, let's think about how we can use digital, but also now start to think about our universities going into other countries. That's happened in China, it's happened to a certain extent in India. But if I was thinking of an industrial strategy, I think health and life sciences and education are three things that this country can be very proud of, and we can grow, and we can help our own patients and citizens around the world.
There's a question from John Osborne. Is the NHS policy of recruiting trained doctors from developing countries to bolster up the NHS? You said about a quarter of them come from overseas. Is that acceptable? Is it sustainable? Because aren't we sort of asset stripping countries like India, which right at the moment need their doctors more than ever?
Yeah, I mean, and also, I know there are many doctors on this call, but there are also other clinicians on the call as well. For example, the Philippine export of nurses is I think it's their third largest export sector. And then obviously the remittances that get sent back help many families. So I wouldn't go so far as to say we should stop it, but there should be much greater reciprocity in terms of the give and the get. And that's why I do think there are opportunities, because the world hasn't got enough doctors, it hasn't got enough nurses, it hasn't got enough medical schools, and it hasn't got enough nursing schools. And we can play a part helping our country and helping the world. So this started with Graham's question some minutes ago. But yeah, I think education for healthcare is a sleeping giant. I would also say that, and I hope Graham doesn't shout at me, historically, the way that we've educated people has been in silos, professional silos. And of course, this new move now for digital is infusing everything. So we should be much more imaginative about the way that we can access people and develop and train them. And just one more thing while I'm on this, Roger, and forgive me. I'm this year just been appointed as a senior fellow, a visiting senior fellow of the University of Toronto and the Rotman School of Management. And 2 weeks ago, we launched the first ever Doctor MBA program, where you can shave a year off being a doctor and getting an MBA at the same time. Now, it's not for everybody, but why shouldn't we do that? And why should Toronto start? We should be starting that. And so I think there's lots to learn from other people, but to answer your question directly, no, we should encourage the global diaspora and global movement of healthcare expertise, but there should be greater reciprocity. And I think what we can do to help other countries is build education systems to train the clinicians of tomorrow. And that's what I would do as part of our industrial strategy as we go global in global Britain.
Yeah. Well, one of the things the RSM has had to do, because our building's been closed for the last year, is that we've had to become digital. And it's quite extraordinary what, we can have conversations like this, and it's almost as though you and I were in the same room. It's really quite extraordinary. Just starting to rain here, so if there's some background noise, that's the rain. So let's go back a little bit, because I wanted to ask you about Birmingham, your experience there, and particularly setting up the Royal Military Organization for looking after wounded soldiers, which has become quite famous, I think, now, hasn't it? How did that happen, Mark?
Well, I mean, Birmingham was the love of my life, and I spent 8.5 years there. But just before we get there, I also want to give a shout out. So I finished the training scheme and then went to St Mary's, where I was a general manager for surgical services across 4 sites: St Charles, St Mary's, the Western Eye Hospital, and the Samaritan Hospital for Women. And that was a brilliant training because I was a rookie manager, and the consultants were both fearsome and awesome in equal measure. So people like Leslie Reagan, people like Claire Marks, people like Jeffrey Glazer, if you remember GG. John Wolfe, Avril Mansfield. I worked with them all and they taught me a hell of a lot. And then I went to Central Middlesex, and that was wonderful because we had the opportunity to build the first ever ambulatory care and diagnostic centre. And we built that nearly 25 years ago. And now, ironically, we're talking about the separation of hot and cold sites to eliminate or help eliminate waiting lists. But Central I went to Central because somebody said, well, you know, it's all right going to these fancy highfalutin teaching hospitals. You need to go and work in the People's Republic of Brent. So off I went for 2.5 years, and we did a lot there. And obviously it was a really special time. Aradazi was just moving from Central back to St Mary's. John Reardon, Sir Graham Morgan, the chief nurse, John Pope, the chief exec. And that taught me about clinical process re-engineering. Look, I know people hate that phrase, but it was a way to demystify clinical processes and think about their similarities rather than their differences, and then start to train staff to be slightly more agile. And of course, we then did a lot to try and promote same-day surgery, or 23-hour, actually it was 18-hour surgery. And it was well ahead of its time. And then I did that for 3 years, and we got that up and running. And then somebody said to me again, because when you've been on the training scheme, you sort of get a star on your folder. And as long as you don't cock up, then you know you've got mentors all the time, and they're really important, whether you're a doctor, a nurse, a AHP, or a manager. And they said, oh, you need to get out of London now, Mark. You need to go somewhere else. So I applied for the Birmingham job. And my boss then was a guy called Sir Jonathan Michael, who's obviously a very good nephrologist. He's retired now. And I went as the Director of Operations, Chief Operating Officer. And then John moved back to Guys and Tommies, where he was trained. And unbelievably, I got the job. And I loved it. It's the love of my life. And we had 5 hospitals, which we then reduced to 2. And then the plan was to go from 2 hospitals, Selly Oak and Queen Elizabeth, to a new Queen Elizabeth Hospital. It took 6.5 years to negotiate the deal. That's PFI for you. We didn't have a choice. It had everything. We had obviously trauma in Selly Oak, and neurosurgery in the Queen Elizabeth. We had burns at Selly Oak, and plastics at Selly Oak, and then other specialties, of course, at the Queen Elizabeth. So we needed to rationalise. And it was great. We created, and this is what I mean about clinical-led movements. We created 47 clinical working groups, which mixed GPs and community practitioners and secondary and tertiary specialists. And we got them to try and envisage new models of care 10 years out. And we had external challenge from other clinicians in case some people were being a bit too stuffy or traditional. By the way, everyone wanted to obviously protect their offices, which I understand. And we created these models of care and then changed the management structure. And that's when we put all the clinicians in charge. And it's one of those moments as a chief exec where you do it, and you do it because you believe it to be true, because it's the right thing to do, not because you've worked it out. And we gave our divisional directors 50% of their time was paid, and we backfilled their time with new consultant appointments. Our group directors, which are a bit like clinical directorates, we gave them between 20 and 30% of their salary, which could go towards a consultant, or we could alleviate their sessions. And it worked. And I used to use the analogy of everyone gets fixated when Selly Oak was 120 years old. People were dying in there that shouldn't have, I think. I hope that's not too dramatic. And it's easy to get fixated with the house, buying a house or building a house. But we were trying to create a home, a new clinical model as well. And it was great. We became a First Wave Foundation Trust. We had some of the best clinical governance reviews from CHI, you might remember them. And the thing that I'm most proud about is that 87% of staff said they were proud to work for UHB. And we built a real can-do attitude. Of course, there were tough moments, and of course, there were clinical. We had at one stage the largest cardiac surgery waiting list in the United Kingdom. So we had challenges, but the clinicians led that change. And as part of that change, Roger, building a new hospital, 1,300 bedded hospital, the largest single hospital ever built in the history of the NHS. We won the competitive bid with 23 other teaching hospitals to house the Royal Centre for Defence Medicine. And that was a really interesting bid. As you know, very strong bases to the south on the coast, not exclusively, but big bases there. No one thought it would go to the middle of the country, let alone Birmingham, where you can't see the sea, any direction, north, south, east or west. And we created it. And then little did we know when we created it, we were into the Afghan theatre of war. And obviously thinking about the composition of Birmingham, that was a very interesting moment in our development. And I never forget seeing young people come back with losing limbs. And I remember touring the facility with the Prime Minister at the time, and having to confront the consequences of war in a medical facility which was being purpose-built for situations like this, which we didn't expect to come at us so quickly. The staff were amazing, and the Royal Centre for Defence Medicine is really smart. It's now spawned research into military medicine, long overdue in this country. And I'm very proud of both, and they'll both see me out. And I often say to my family, I'd like to be buried under the reception of the new QE. I don't think they'll let me do that, and I'm not planning to go just yet. But they were the best of times. It was the clinicians were amazing, and when you're all pulling together with a clear strategic direction, good, holding each other to account. It wasn't come by our collaborative. It was professional and high accountability and high expectations for performance. But it was a great 8.5 years, and as you can see, I've still got the accent. Although it's a bit of a cold. It rained yesterday, and I was cycling, so as it's raining here now as well on my windows. But Birmingham is a great university hospital, and the thing that made me really proud during COVID, and obviously a clinician now runs it, Dave Rosser. So we've had Jonathan Michael, who was a nephrologist, then me, a manager. Then Dame Julie Moore, a nurse, and now Dr. David Rosser, a consultant intensivist. And what made me really proud, because not everyone wanted us to have a new building. There was a lot of politics around the PFI as well. It got very political, and then people lost sight sometimes of the patient benefits. But what I was really proud about this year was seeing how the 1,200 beds that we built, it's now up to, by the way, it's up to 1,300 or 1,400 now, in the new QE, is how they could flex for critical care. Because when we built it, we built Europe's largest critical care unit of 125 beds. And Dave tells me, I might be misremembering, but it flexed up to 500, 600, 700 critical care beds to look after the people of the West Midlands, 5 million people. And that's why, new infrastructure is so important when you look at the comparatives that we have in terms of workforce, equipment, anything you name. We're at the lower end of that OECD or G7 league table. And we should be thankful we've got it, but we need more. So I love Birmingham. And the theme is clinicians have taught me so much during my career, working, because they are the most fascinating, inspired, intelligent and educated human beings on the planet. And if they can be directed and supported to march in the same direction, anything is possible.
Well, I love the enthusiasm in your voice when you describe those hospitals, which I know quite well, because I did some of my training in Wolverhampton, which is a brilliant place to experience. So Anthony McKeever says, you know him, as a successful CEO in your early career, I can recall you had an exciting vision for healthcare in the UK. If that young man could travel forward in time, what would he find disappointing about the progress that the NHS has made? It's a slightly existential question. I mean, do you feel, after that enthusiastic description just given us, do you feel a little bit disappointed now, or do you feel we're going to come on to talk about all the amazing ideas you have in that book of yours?
Yes and no. I mean, I think, well, I mean, personally, I hope you can see that I'm as enthusiastic about healthcare today, 32 years later on, as I was when I joined the management training scheme in September 1989. I just think it's the best industry sector in the world. All of life and death is in it. And so I haven't lost my enthusiasm. And I think then to answer Mac's question, yeah, there was no doubt that, you know, during the period 2000 to 2009-10, we had funding settlements of about 6% per annum. And when I left the NHS in 2009-10, we had the highest levels of patient, public, and staff satisfaction. So the investment did work. Some of it was wasted, or perhaps could have been used better. We can talk about that. But then, of course, we had the global financial crisis. So I'm not blaming anybody. The government of the day had to take corrective action. So to answer Mac's question directly, in life, you would hope that as human beings and institutions, they develop. But development is not always linear. And sadly, that period from 2010 onwards, you know, funding settlements were much lower. And we've seen the consequences now. I mean, one of the things, if we do get to talk about global observations, for the last 15 months, I've been running about 97 COVID programs globally. We helped to establish the Nightingale hospitals here in the United Kingdom. And I can tell you that the reason why I'm fearful about workforce is most countries used to see healthcare as a cost, not as a value. But I can tell you now, Roger, the work that I do around the world, every country has woken up to the fact that a flourishing health system, a sustainable health system, is good for the country and good for the economy. It's one of the best national insurance policies you can have. And of course, now this reawakening in terms of countries, thinking about if they had a health system that wasn't running so hot, would they have got out of the first wave quicker? Would they get out of the second wave quicker? So I think this issue now about industrial strategy and health policy, this is the time to strike. This is the moment to join those two things up, and to do so from a position of confidence because of our vaccination program here, but also, you know, other countries have done better than us. So we can learn from Singapore, we can learn from South Korea, we can learn from Japan, we can learn in part from China. What they're doing with virtual hospitals is staggering. So am I disappointed? Yeah, a little bit, but I suppose getting older, I'm a bit more realistic that sadly we don't all develop at the same pace in a linear fashion, and sometimes you have to go back a step or two to take 2 or 3 steps forward. And I suppose that's how it's felt over the last decade, and I hope it doesn't feel like this for the next decade.
Yeah, well, austerity has taken a toll, and we had Michael Marmot on the program a few weeks ago, and explaining, you know, just the health implications of austerity and the drawbacks of that. But let's stick with you, and let's move down the M1 to from Birmingham to London, and then around that time you had a bit of a health scare, Mark, and you said you were prepared to talk a little bit about that before we go global.
Yeah. Before we get on the M1, I had to get on the M5, Roger, and go to South Central. But I was sent there. It was once again deemed good for my development, and that was tough because we had to make a lot of efficiency savings. So I did that for a year, and people like Graham were very helpful. That was a tough year. And then I was invited to become a Director General, which I did then, working with Sir David Nicholson, Sir Hugh Taylor, and Lord Aradazi on high quality care for all. And that was great because then we still had enough money to dream and to think about improving models of care. So you've seen the examples about the centralisation of trauma in London and so on and so forth. So we and Dame Ruth Carnell did that, of course, in London. That was a good period. But yeah, as you say, sadly, I discovered at the age of 42, quite by chance, I had prostate cancer, something I know that you've had as well, and you spent your life trying to treat and cure. But it knocked me sideways because I didn't see it coming. I just thought I was, obviously working crazy hours, 12, 13 hours a day, just thought I was tired, and then had a checkup, and my PSA was very high. And long story short, thanks to the surgeons and the clinical team at Charing Cross. I had a radical prostatectomy, and I do talk about it because I think it's important to talk about your experiences with cancer to raise awareness. Obviously not to this audience tonight, but all the royalties of my books go to Prostate Cancer UK, and me and you sat on the board together. In fact, you were, as you know, with others as well, highly instrumental in setting up Prostate Cancer UK. It's a global force, and the tie-up with Movember, who I knew in Melbourne anyway. Obviously, you know, the Moustache charity people, for those that don't know, or Men's Mental Health as well now. And it's not nice at 42 being infertile, impotent, and incontinent. Now, two of those three things are reversed, as you know, over time, but it hit me pretty hard at 42, to be honest with you. And then it made me think about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I'd done 20 years in the NHS, and I thought, Christ, I could have died. And it makes you think then about what you want to do next. But and I write about it in my book because the surgery and the care at Charing Cross was leading 21st century clinical medicine at its best. And then I was catapulted out into the community, and there was no coordination of care, no integration of care, and I was left on my own. And funny enough, you know, I know clinicians know how to take a catheter out or look after it, but that wasn't my specialty. I didn't. By the way, I didn't take my own catheter out. But the point I wanted to make is that, and the surgeon, I don't know whether I should mention his name or not, but the surgeon that did the operation quite rightly wanted to see whether I could be a same-day patient because I was young. So and he was really chuffed that I did leave. I came at 7 o'clock in the morning. I left at 7:30 at night. But bloody hell, it knocked me sideways. And so I was glad to be his guinea pig, but no one really gave me enough preparation to understand what the aftercare would be like. So the point is, the more we talk about these things, whether it's breast cancer or prostate cancer, lung cancer, of course, sadly, the outcomes are still nowhere near where they need to be. The more awareness, the better chance we have of solving it together. But it did knock me about. And I got depressed really after it as well. I think when you're 42 and you think these things are going to function at least for a while longer, it makes you think about yourself as a man and a human being. And so I did a bit of thinking really. And then of course I did the stupid thing. I went back to work after four weeks, which is just the stupidest thing I ever did.
Yeah.
No, one of the stupidest things I ever did.
Yeah. Well, we've all done stupid things, but I do remember that catheter at home is just a nightmare. So yeah, that was quite brave of you to be discharged on 24 hours. But so was that the trigger for leaving, for going to KPMG? It
was one of the triggers. And then I'd always been told that the private sector was better than the public sector. And I thought, I want to test myself. And by the way, that's not true. Okay, the top 1 or 5% in the private sector is as good as the top 1 or 5% of the public sector. But the values in the public sector will make people give so much more. Private organisations, if they could bottle what we have in the NHS or the best parts of it, they would surely try and bottle it and keep it. It's an amazing thing. This purpose is, and the values are amazing. So, but I wanted to test myself, and they said, come along and you can be our global head of health. And going back to my upbringing, I actually didn't get on a plane. We couldn't afford to travel until I was 22. So my first flight was at 22 to Spain. It cost me £29. I remember it well. And I wanted to see the world, and because I've always been curious about how other people lead their health systems. And the growth of health systems are really grown out of the evolution and development of the nation states of those continents and those countries. And they said, go and run it. So I essentially ran a very big global enterprise, and have worked in 80 countries on 351 occasions with public sector organizations, governments, charities, and private sector organizations, depending on where I was in the world. And if Birmingham was the first love of my life, this job is certainly probably the most interesting, because you know, Seneca said a change of scenery is a change of mind, and it is. You don't stop thinking ever, and you meet some quite brilliant people who are all trying their best to make their health systems or their organisations the best or better for patients. And yeah, I went into it not knowing really what it was all about, and I've enjoyed it. It's been a real odyssey, the journey, and I wrote about it because I think every country has something to teach and every country has something to learn. And but traveling 3 weeks out of 4 for 11 years, I mean, you know, it's stressful, and it takes its toll on you. You don't sleep ever properly. By the way, you know, I'm not feeling sorry for myself. It's just an amazing experience to work in all these countries. And if we've got time, we can talk about, you know, the best and the worst. I'd rather stick with the best, but if you push me out, we can talk about the worst as well.
I think we should. You're around the world in 80 countries. I mean, let me, before that, I mean, your carbon footprint must be enormous, but we won't go.
Yeah. Well, no, we should, Roger. So, because I stepped down from the global role in October.
Yeah.
Because and you know, I write about climate change in my book, and yeah, I was burning the skies. My daughter, who's 16, has been on the marches, and I can tell you that there's no more effective lobbyer than a 16-year-old daughter that won't stop talking to her father about what's wrong about this. So, and I know also, I've seen the effects of climate change. So we do a lot of work in the Caribbean, and I've seen with the hurricanes how they have destroyed Caribbean islands, that the cost of insurance and reinsurance for those islands sometimes is as much or more than they spend on healthcare. So I haven't done a lot of Africa. I've worked in 5 or 6 countries in Africa, but I've seen it at play in the Caribbean, and I know its potential devastation, and that's why climate change is a health emergency as well. And so I'm not proud of the flying. Now, of course, there is a different way to go. And, you know, as I said, running these COVID projects globally, I've done it from the comfort here of my kitchen.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important that we come on to talk about, because I think the final chapter in your book is some solutions, but there are quite a few questions. We've got 46 questions now, so I can never get through them all. One of them is about third world, developing country medicine and the problems there. And they're saying that there still is quite a bit of corruption. There's a lot of wastage. And I think, you know, I've gone to Africa and done a few operations, but it seems to me that the problems are so intractable.
Yeah.
You know, what can you do? And so maybe talk a little bit about India, because of the COVID crisis there. And we've got so many people from India working in the NHS. I think, what are your thoughts about the Indian healthcare system and that brave attempt of Modi that you've already mentioned, but now confronted by COVID, it seems to be overwhelmed.
Yeah, well, just before we get to India, let's just talk a bit about, say, Brazil in Africa. And it's wrong to talk about Africa. There are 54 nation states in Africa. But whoever asked the question, and forgive the jargon, but the supply chain leakage in those countries can often account for between 10 and 12% of a country's spend on healthcare. So is it right to call it out? Yes. Have some international agencies sometimes observed it without tackling it? Probably yes. Is it a matter that countries need to address before they build their universal healthcare system? Yes, because you need to professionalize the supply chain to eliminate or to reduce corruption. And I saw that in Brazil, and I've seen it in certain parts of, I've worked in South Africa 26 or 27 times. Actually, when I was chief exec of Birmingham, we trained hundreds of black doctors and nurses. So we were twinned with hospitals in Joburg and Cape Town for a long time. But on India, Roger, it spends 3% of its GDP, 4% of its GDP on healthcare. Only 1.2% of that goes to the public sector. I've worked in the shanty towns of India, and I've marveled at the marble halls of their private hospitals. The Gini coefficient, like Brazil, is just impossible to justify in terms of humanity. And sadly now, in spite of Modi's announcements, we've seen the human toll. You know, they were complacent during the first wave, arguably. They locked down quicker than we did, arguably. They thought they got away with it, and then the second wave now is ripping through their country with all the horrible graphic images that we've become accustomed to. And in a sense, Modi anticipated the universal healthcare. He knows that Indians are dying too early, too often. He started to make changes to the primary care platform, started to talk about how he develops his own health workers. As you know, they've got traditional health workers as well. He had some interesting plans for that. What I hear at the moment, all that's stalled, obviously, because people are fighting over, well, people are trying to find oxygen, sorry. So I think it is going to set him back. He's just lost 3 elections, as you know, out of the 5 state elections. And my fear is there have been, in my 12 years globally, there have been at least 3 promises in India to start universal healthcare. And his promise 3 years ago, he was starting to put words into action, and his money where his mouth was. I hope he continues after COVID, but you know, as Macmillan said, events. I hope they don't get blown off course, but I think they probably will do. And of course, Modi was with one eye on China, who obviously have over 12 years moved very quickly in terms of their health reforms for universal healthcare. He was taunting the Chinese at one stage, saying it was the greatest migration towards universal healthcare in the history of humankind. So I hope he remembers those words and acts upon them after COVID.
Yeah. Well, we've got 10 minutes left, just less than that. And I mean, Mrs. Thatcher said, you know, I don't want to hear about problems, I want solutions. I've got a copy of your book there handy. No, you probably haven't, but
I haven't. You didn't tell me. I need to wave it around.
You could have flashed out. I've been reading it this afternoon, and I really recommend it. I think everybody should read it. And I like, particularly the last chapter. I think Charlotte helped you with that, gathering some of the information she was telling me before. But I mean, one of the solutions you give is about the workforce and the crisis of the workforce. That's also in your first book. But Richard Worth says we're not doing enough to retain our doctors. How do we correct this crisis? So just talk about some of those 5 or 6 ideas that you come up with in the end. In those
so this is a global. Dr. Refsum, who's a GP, is my global executive, and she came off the National Medical Directors Clinical Fellowship, and she was in charge of helping me write the book, but also did all the research. There are about 7,000 articles that connect healthcare with the workforce. And sadly, they're longer on problems and shorter on solutions. And as I started to travel the world after I published my first book in 2015, I started to say to clients, you know, we'd be working on wherever it was. And I'd say, if you've got a workforce problem, they say, a big issue about talent, big issue about workforce. And then, you know, when you've got an idea in your mind, you just, wherever you go, I started to think about it. And then by 2016, I thought, 17, I started to read more. And this goes back partly to Graham's point before. I started to despair that people were wallowing in the problem and not coming out with solutions apart from more money, of course, and that is part of a solution. So we set up the research team. I obviously working around the world, started to think about organizations that had succeeded, and I put together 10 points. Now, we haven't got time, fortunately, we've only got 5 minutes left, but the points include getting professions to play at the top of their game, not all the time, because that will exhaust them, but we know from the BMA in the RCN that about 19% of tasks that doctors do, they think can be done by somebody else, or a robot or technology, and about 20% or so nurses feel the same. So getting people to play at the top of their profession, or being able to, is very important. And so that's one issue. And then obviously then the second issue is, how can technology, automation, robotics, artificial intelligence help? We've then got a big section on patients as partners. If patients can take more control or more responsibility for their care, there are 4 levels of patient activation. Counterintuitively, the more confident patients become, they become less reliant on using health services, more self-confident. We look at examples where communities have become carers. So, for example, in Germany, the oldest population now, as you know, in Europe, They didn't have enough workers. Merkel got into a big political fight about immigration coming from Turkey and other places. So they paid the elderly patients who were at home. They could choose their family members or the providers. They were trained to provide social care, paid between £300, the equivalent, and £2,000 per month, regulated and trained. So then we talk about looking at how new models of care, so integrated care, looking at clinical improvement methodologies can enhance productivity. So I'm not doing the book justice, but essentially I try my best to say that this challenge of 18 million workers by 2030 is enormous. We know we're in 2021. We know it takes a decade to train highly competent clinicians, doctors, medics in particular. But there are 10 things that we can do about it. And I then use examples, practical examples of health systems or organizations that have solved some of these issues. And it's an easy read. Each chapter can be read in the time that it takes to drink a cup of coffee. And I know that my first book, In Search of the Perfect Health System, that looked at health systems, I know it was bought by a lot of doctors who were preparing for their consultant interviews. So I hope that you read the second book as well as the first, and all proceeds go to Prostate Cancer UK.
So the book is called Humans Solving the Global Workforce Crisis. And yeah, I really, really do recommend it. Mark, so we're getting near the end of time. I always ask this question of our interviewees, and we've had some fantastic people, Michael Palin, and Lloyd Webber, and now Mark Britnell. Wow. What's the thing you're most proud of looking back? What would you say is your standout? I mean, you've achieved so much. It's quite remarkable what you've achieved. But is there anything stick out amongst all those achievements?
Yeah, building the new Queen Elizabeth Hospital. People said it could never be done, and we'd waited 60 or 70 years for a new hospital. But actually, if you push me further, the thing I'm really proud about is that 87% of the staff felt that they were proud of UHB, and you can't fake that. And so they would be two standouts. And then I think personally, given my background, we only had 3 books in our house. It shouldn't happen to a Bible in my football annual. And for me to write 2 books and to be awarded Best Healthcare Book in China, the first foreigner ever to receive that award, and also to get the nod from the BMA, that makes me personally very proud, because I'm now in a privileged position. And I think people like us need to share our information and knowledge, and together then we can go forward. But I think that perhaps they will bury me under the reception of the new QE. Who knows?
Last question, which football team do you support then, Mark?
Man City, and I'm so proud of what we did. I'm not a plastic supporter. I played for the Junior Blues many, many years ago. And actually, it's 22 years to this month that I was at Wembley and we were in the 3rd division playoffs. So to see that result last night fills me with joy. So that's my team, yeah.
Well, Simon, Wesley and I are hoping that our team, Chelsea, will be meeting you in Istanbul on the 29th of May. So
yeah, I fear that, Roger, because I think you've got the better of us. You've got the measure of us. And I actually think the whole world wants to see Real Madrid versus Manchester City. 2 attacking teams play football at their best.
Well, we'll see what happens tonight. They're kicking off in a few minutes.
Yeah, good luck.
Now, don't go away, because I've just got a few announcements to make. So we are very proud of everything that we do digitally at the RSM, but we are reopening our building on the 17th of May. So I would really encourage you to come back and use our facilities after the 17th of May. We have been losing money for the last year, £4.5 million deficit. So we need you back in the building, and we do need some donations from you. If you've got some spare cash, please do donate to the RSM to keep us going with our education and innovation program. Well, tomorrow we have our COVID meeting, and we have a really exciting meeting. We're talking about coagulopathy, of course, the complication of some of the vaccines, and COVID itself causes some dreadful coagulation problems. So that's tomorrow. Next week, we have the 5th of our climate change programs, webinars at 6 o'clock on Tuesday evening. We're talking about digestive impact of climate change, as the water we drink and the dangerous food that we eat, and the impact on the planet. So your daughter would be in that, I'm sure. And then next week for In Conversation, I'm back. You've got me back again as the interrogator. And we've got Bertie Lee, who is probably the foremost medical defense solicitor. Fantastic guy. He's also written a book. In fact, we're hunting around now for publishers, but I don't know whether he'll sell as many copies as you have, Mark, with your fantastic book. So last plug for your book, and many, many thanks. We have 57 questions down here, so I'm so sorry we haven't had time to ask them all, but we have, I think, gone through your life and your achievements and at least given them a bit of an airing. So thank you so much, Mark. Thank you all our members, and don't forget, you can, if you're not a member, you can join the RSM. You can come to our building at 1 Wimpole Street. We'd love to see you there. Farewell, everybody, and come on, Chelsea.